So this week we're diving back into our study of the book of Esther. When we left off, there was quite a bit of strategic maneuvering that was taking place on the chessboard of this political scene that is the book of Esther. I don't know if any of you have read it all the way through. I would encourage you to do so. It's pretty short. It's relatively easy to read. You could probably do it this afternoon in an hour and a half, maybe. And you're going to read through it and you go, this should be a Netflix series. After The Chosen, they should do Esther. There's some political drama taking place. There was some maneuvering on the chessboard when we were last in the story. Esther, an orphaned Jewish girl, through humility and wise counsel, rises to be the queen of Persia, queen next to King Xerxes. She had arrived in this position partially due to the wise counsel of her uncle Mordecai, who now serves as a palace official in the capital, where he serves the king well, even foiling a plot to assassinate Xerxes at one point. Then we're introduced to another player. Someone else steps on to the chessboard, Haman, who due to his favor with the king had become second in command of the empire. Scripture reads in Esther chapter 3, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agite, over all other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. All the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by. For so the king commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow down or show him respect. So now, one of our key players takes a big ego hit. You don't step into second in command of a kingdom because you're a pretty humble guy, right? And there's this one palace guard who refuses to bow down. Well, Haman couldn't stand this. So naturally, his response is to sign into law, with the king's blessing, a day where the entire Jewish population of Persia was to be exterminated. Pretty reasonable response. Is this sounding somewhat familiar from a couple weeks ago? Okay. We're catching up to where we're at in this story. So having discovered this law, having discovered its devastating impact, Mordecai reaches out to the one person he thinks has the power to do something. His niece, Queen Esther. Esther chapter 4, beginning on verse 13. Mordecai sent this reply to Esther, "Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. But you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just a time as this." So Esther calls for the Jewish people to fast alongside her as she prays for discernment, seeking to take the next right step. And this is where we pick up the story this morning in our political drama of life and death. In Esther chapter 5, beginning on verse 1. On the third day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace, just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her and held out the gold scepter to her. So Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. The king asked her, "What do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you even if it's half the kingdom." And Esther replied, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for the king." The king turned to his attendant and said, "Tell Haman to come quickly to a banquet as Esther has requested." So the king and Haman went to Esther's banquet. And while they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "Now tell me what you really want. What is your request? I will give it to you even if it is half of the kingdom." Esther replied, "This is my request and my deepest wish. If I have found favor with the king and it pleases the king to grant my request, do what I ask. Please come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for you. Then I will explain what this is all about." In the fulfillment of her role as queen, Esther must maneuver carefully. So, do you remember what happened to the last queen? What happened that put Esther in this position? Queen Vashti was summoned to the king's presence so he could parade her around as a display of beauty and sexual desire amongst all of his other leaders in the kingdom. Vashti declined, and in response to that, the king banished her, stripped her of her royal title, and exiled her. In this, she lost not just her royal status, but her family, her friends, and she became a shamed outcast in Persia. So now we find Esther having to go before the king, petition him to repeal or countermand the law that his most trusted advisor signed into effect. So Esther, deciding to take action to protect her people, has to navigate within these cultural customs and norms of the Persian Empire. She has to play the game. Now think of how hard that must have been to plan not one, but 2 banquets, to honor a king, her husband, who agreed to a law that would lead to a mass genocide. And not only that, but she invites the right-hand man to the king, the man whose hatred led to the law that would kill all of her people. She has to plan these 2 banquets, humble herself, come before the king, and invite both of them to sit at her table. She has to play by the rules. She has to operate within the guidelines. She has to kiss the ring. Now, that idea feels kind of blasphemous, doesn't it? There's something within us that recoils at that idea. Especially as Americans, our country was born in rebellion. We don't kiss the ring of power just because it's power. In fact, there's a part of us that wants to fight against it, not because we disagree, but simply because that's what we do, right? In the Declaration of Independence, it lists what were at the time radical, unalienable rights for all people, for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those rights spit in the face of the monarchy. They spit in the face of a culture of social status that was the English Empire. That rebellious nature against the powers that be is almost held up as a virtue in our culture. And yet, we don't see that in Esther. What we see in Esther is not rebellion in the face of oppression. We don't see rebellion in the impending annihilation of the Jews. Esther doesn't make a radical call to arms. What we see is a response of humility, a response that would be indirectly described centuries later by the Apostle Paul as he counseled believers in the early Christian church on how to engage politically in a world that was diametrically opposed to the values and the love of God. Romans 13, beginning on verse 1, everyone must submit to the governing authorities, for all authority comes from God, and those in positions of authority have been placed there by God. So anyone who rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and they will be punished. For the authorities do not strike fear in people who are doing right, but in those who are doing wrong. Would you like to live without fear of authorities? Do what is right, and they will honor you. The authorities are God's servants, sent for your good, but if you are doing wrong, of course you should be afraid, for they have the power to punish you. They are God's servants, sent for the very purpose of punishing those who do what is wrong. So you must submit to them, not only to avoid punishment, but also to keep a clear conscience. Now sit with that for a second. How does that weigh on your heart this morning in the world that we live in? I don't know about you, but it brings up a lot of discomfort in me. The authorities are God's servants, sent for your good. If you are doing wrong, of course you should be afraid, for they have the power to punish you. They are God's servants, sent for the very purpose of punishing those who do what is wrong. So much wrong has been justified by evil hearts that pervert and twist these words from Paul for their own selfish gain. But Paul is drawing our attention to a reality of living relationally. Paul is drawing our attention to the reality of living relationally. It's impossible to live in a world and be separate from that world. It is impossible to live in this world and separate yourself from this world. No man is an island. We, as followers of Christ, cannot follow the Great Commission to go and make disciples of Jesus Christ without going into the culture of the world. Those are the people we're called to go and share the gospel with. We can't follow the Great Commission without operating within the human institutions and governing bodies. Now, there's a difference between going into the world as a missionary and going into the world as a sponge. And we could spend hours, weeks, multiple sermons pulling truth and wisdom from these words from Paul. But in this moment, what we need to realize is that Paul's wise counsel to the church in Rome is a thread that runs throughout the biblical narrative. It's a thread that preaches love and living in a way that honors your neighbor. We see it embodied in Esther as she submits to the authority of the Persian state. She honors the leadership of a human institution, but she does so without compromising her obedience to God. This is a thread that runs through the biblical narrative, and it's thick in New Testament writings. 1 Peter chapter 2. For the Lord's sake, submit to all human authority. See, Paul wasn't just some nut job writing about submitting to the government. 1 Peter chapter 2, for the Lord's sake, submit to all human authority, whether the king as head of state or the officials he has appointed. For the king has sent them to punish those who do wrong and to honor those who do right. It is God's will that your honorable lives should silence those ignorant people who make foolish accusations against you. For you are free, yet you are God's slaves. So don't use your freedom as an excuse to do evil. Respect everyone and love the family of believers. Fear God and respect the king. And again, we could spend hours gleaning from this text, digging into this text. But at the heart of it is about placing God first, and when we do that, we're compelled to love our neighbor. If God is at the center of who we are compelled to love and honor our neighbor. There's a difference between submitting to human authority and being owned by human authority. It's impossible to live in a world and be separate from a world, but there's a difference between being in a culture and being of a culture. There's a difference between being informed by the world and formed by it. So now Esther lays the groundwork for her petition. She's navigating the political arena. She's honoring God and submitting to the authority of those above her, gaining favor with the king, showing honor to him and Haman. And in this scene, our camera pans to the right-hand man. In chapters 5 and 6 of Esther's story, we follow Haman, a man who not only lives within the culture by operating by its rules and guidelines, but he has allowed the culture of a fallen world to permeate his heart. We almost see these two different approaches to the world set alongside each other in Esther and Haman. Esther chapter 5, beginning on verse 9. Haman was a happy man as he left the banquet. But when he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up or trembling nervously before him, Haman became furious. However, he restrained himself and went home. Then Haman gathered together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, and boasted to them about his great wealth and his many children. He bragged about the honors the king had given him and how he had been promoted over all other nobles and officials. Then Haman added, "That's not all. Queen Esther invited only me and the king himself to a banquet she prepared for us. And she has invited me to dine with her and the king again tomorrow." Then he added, "But all of this is worth nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting there at the palace gate." So Haman's wife Zeresh and all his friends suggested, "Set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall, and in the morning ask the king to impale Mordecai on it. When this is done, you can go on your merry way to the banquet." It's a pretty reasonable response, isn't it? There's a difference between being in the culture and being of the culture. There's a difference between being informed by the world and being formed by it. It's a perennial human disorder that though nations rise and fall, the enemy works in the shadows and tries to promise each of us life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, the definitions of those terms change as power structures change, as our values change, as our vision changes. Who defines a person? For a long time in our world, that was a huge debate. Who defines liberty? Who defines happiness? And while those definitions change, the vision of the world remains fixated on a life of happiness and freedom. And in that fixation, there comes a subtle transformation where we can become consumed by the self-centeredness that results from the pursuit of happiness. We become consumed in the same way we see Haman consumed. So going to college, into my senior year of college, I was determined to take the starting spot on the offensive line for the football team. I had played all 3 years before, and this was it, right? I mean, you put in work. It's like any job. If you put in the work, you're due a reward, right? You're working towards something. So I'd put in the work. I knew the offensive playbook inside and out. I even wrote a 10-page paper on offensive theory for our team, why we run the plays we run and why we block the way we do. This has been my singular focus since the very beginning. I mean, that's the whole reason you do it, to go on and take that number one spot. And I knew coming into that year that the main concern about me from the coaches was I was small. I was undersized. I was pretty tiny for someone who would play guard or tackle on the offensive line. So going into that year, the summer leading into that year, I decided to do something about it. And I worked out twice a day. So I worked as a landscaper during the day. So I'd go into the weight room at 4:45 in the morning, and I'd lift for 2 hours. Then I'd go to work, and I'd get off work, and I'd go lift for 2 more hours, and I'd go home. And that was the whole summer, because this is what it's all about, right? We're going to get that starting spot. So I arrived at camp, and for 2 weeks, I busted tail. I took all the starting reps of the offensive line. I lifted with the first team groups in the weight room. I spent time teaching my younger teammates different techniques, studying film with them, making sure that they were learning the right ways to do things. And I knew if I could hold this spot, that starting spot through camp, once season started, it'd be cruise control, because you don't change starters out after camp's done. That's nuts. You don't do that. So the starting lineup was pretty much set after camp. And the last day of camp rolls around, and we're getting ready to go out to practice. I got my cleats on, and then my position coach calls me into his office before practice started. And maybe you have an inkling of where this is going. I didn't. He calls me in, and he tells me, even though I had a great camp and he really appreciated the effort I'd put in and how I had coached the younger players, he was still concerned about my size and my durability, and that I wasn't going to start that year. So what was the point? What was the point of practice if I knew going out every day I wasn't competing for anything? It was hard not to walk away right then. I sat in my locker for what felt like an eternity. I came out to practice late. And for the next 3 months, anger was the only thing that made me get out of bed in the morning. I was so angry. And I made sure the person that lined up across from me knew it was their fault. I spent 3 months punishing anyone who dared stand in front of me because they took away what was mine. Taking out my anger, the past year's worth of work, all of this wasted effort. What is the happiness you're pursuing? What's been dangling out in front of you that feels like it's just out of reach? And right as you get there, the string pulls and the carrot disappears. What's the thing you're chasing because you know once you have it, everything's going to fall into place? It'll have all been worth it if I can get to this one thing. What has consumed your vision? Now, I hate to tell you, happiness is fleeting. Happiness doesn't last. In the pursuit of happiness, we run down a dead-end hallway. We get backed into a corner and we're left staring at a mirror that just shows us how far we've come for nothing. And what's left to fill the void that was supposed to be filled by happiness? Shame? Regret? Anger? When we pursue our own happiness, we get lost pursuing the stuff of the world. And if we aren't careful, rather than living in the world as agents of radical transformation for God, we can begin to live in the world and we become formed by the world. James, the half-brother of Jesus, wrote this in his letter to the Jerusalem council. You want what you don't have, so you scheme and kill to get it. You are jealous of what others have, but you can't get it. So you fight and wage war to take it away from them. And yet you don't have what you want because you don't ask God for it. And even when you ask, you don't get it because your motives are all wrong. You want only what will give you pleasure, you adulterers. Don't you realize that friendship with the world makes you an enemy of God? I say it again, if you want to be a friend of the world, you make yourself an enemy of God. When we pursue our own happiness, we get lost pursuing the stuff of the world. When we pursue our own happiness, our own comfort, when we make exhaustive efforts to avoid pain and discomfort, we turn our back on God for the pursuit of selfish desires. Even though we like to identify with Esther as we've read through this story, the outcast, the underdog, the one who doesn't have a chance, the one who has to be very careful because she really has no resources on her side, we more often find ourselves in the position of Haman. All of this is worth nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the palace gate. Set up a sharpened pole, and in the morning, I'll have the king impale him. Have you ever found yourself saying that? All of this is worth nothing if I can't get to right there. It's crazy how easily we forget the life Jesus models for us. A life of humility and service. A life of selflessness. A life that honors your neighbor. We reject that because the world tells us we should have a life that fulfills our work that we've put in. A life that gives us the rewards that we've earned. Our culture promises each person life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but our God promises his people will experience life, liberty, in the pursuit of his love. Our God promises that his people will experience life, liberty, in the pursuit of his love. We see these two visions set side by side in Esther and Haman. As they both navigate the politics of the Persian Empire, Haman is clinging to the promise of life, liberty, and happiness. And he's going to do anything to gain all three of those. And then you have Esther, who's living out the faith in God's promise of life, freedom, and love. You know, there's a radical truth that comes through when you start reading Scripture. God doesn't want your happiness. He wants your heart. God doesn't want your happiness. He wants your heart. Now, that doesn't mean you don't experience happiness in life. The more we pursue God, he promises the more joy we will experience. The difference is, rather than finding happiness in the things of this world, he is the source of our joy. God promises joy. It's one of the fruits of the Spirit. But God didn't place you here to be happy. He created you to experience his love and to be an agent of radical restoration in a broken world. He created you to experience his love and share that love with those who desperately need it. When we substitute the pursuit of God's love for the pursuit of happiness, we spiral into the void of a self-centered heart, an empty void that will never be filled. no matter what we dump into it. And it consumes us and it holds us back from being God-centered. It holds us back from being outwardly focused. It holds us back from being agents of restoration and love. And ultimately, when we fight hand over fist to pursue our own will, to find our own happiness, to pursue our own desires, God's will always comes through. No matter how hard you fight to get what you want, God's will always comes through. We see that if we look back to the story of Esther. Esther 6, beginning on verse 1. That night, the king had trouble sleeping. So he ordered an attendant to bring the book of history of his reign so he could read it. Sure. In those records, he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigathanah and Teresh, two eunuchs who guarded the door of the king's private quarters. They had plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. What reward or recognition did we give Mordecai for this? The king asked. His attendants replied, nothing has been done for him. Who is that in the outer court? The king inquired. As it happened, Haman had just arrived in the outer court of the palace to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole he had prepared. So the attendants replied to the king, Haman is out in the court. Well, bring him in, the king ordered. So Haman came in, and the king said, what should I do for a man who truly pleases me? Well, Haman thought to himself, whom would the king wish to honor more than me? So he replied, if the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with the royal emblem on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. And let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes and led through the city square on the king's horse. Have the official shout as they go, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. Excellent, the king said to Haman. Quick, take these robes and my horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew. Ouch. And that's where the episode ends, and then you got to wait for next week, right? You know, there comes a point when you have to step outside yourself and realize it's not about you. There comes a point when you have to step outside yourself and realize it's not about you. The timing of events don't fit into your plan because it's never been your plan. So I spent a majority of that final season of football fueled by anger. I was a pretty pissed off person. And I did finally come to a point where I had to ask myself, what was this all for? You know, a college football season is very, very long, and it's grueling, and it sucks. What was it all for? That year was the last year of my entire life I'd ever be able to play that sport. You know, basketball, soccer, baseball, all of these have co-ed leagues that you can play on into adulthood. You can't put pads on and go play football when you're 40 unless you're in the NFL. Ultimately, I came to a place where I was just proud that I had completed 4 years of college football. There weren't too many people who could say that. My freshman class in college had 93 players. When we reached graduation, there were 16 of us. 93 to 16. And as we were finishing up at the end of the season banquet, one of my teammates came up to me and he shook my hand. He was younger than me. He was one of them that took my starting spot, who I'd just spent the last 3 years really hating. He shook my hand and he said, I want to thank you. My freshman year, it was one of the hardest years of my life. And I was one phone call away from walking away from this all. I missed my family, practices sucked, camp sucked, classes were hard, but you invited me to eat dinner with you. And you always made sure I had a partner in practice. You always made sure I had a seat at the table, and if it weren't for you, I would have gone home. And in that moment, I felt like the biggest fool anyone could have felt like. I wasn't there for me. I didn't put in that work for me. I had allowed my desire, my pursuit of happiness, to blind me to who God had put around me. I was blind to the person God had placed in my path so I could impact him for God's glory. And if I had that big of impact on him, when I was self-centered and fueled by anger, imagine what I could have done if I would have just gotten out of the way and been God-centered. There comes a point where you have to step outside yourself and realize it's not about you. Life isn't about you. It's about the one who created you, the one who calls you by name, the one who loves you in the messiest parts of your life. God calls us into the hard places. He calls us into the uncomfortable spaces. He calls us into the deep waters because it's not about you. It's not about what you can do. It's not about where you want to go. It's about him. It's about his love. It's about his power. It's about his authority. And it's about what he wants to do through you. And the life and freedom that can only be found in him results when you pursue his love. Luke 9, beginning on verse 23, then Jesus said to the crowd, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross daily, and follow me. If you're trying to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world, but you yourself are lost or destroyed? So as we followed this story of Esther, we cannot look past the warning that is Haman. What we see in Esther is a radical trust of God's protection, actionable faith that God will do what he says. Esther is a woman of humility with a God-centered heart. And what we see in Haman is a man who has been consumed by the desires of the world, a man whose self-centeredness has devoured him. And the uncomfortable truth of this part of the story is that we are more like Haman than we are Esther. We are more easily consumed by self-centered desire than humility and submission. We are less likely to give up our own lives than we are to give up the destructive patterns of our life. So let these 2 chapters of Esther, let this Sunday be a warning sign. It's not about you. God doesn't want your happiness, he wants your heart. I'd like to invite the singers to come back up. In his letter to the church in Rome, Paul writes, so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all he has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind he will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship him. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. So there's one question you need to answer for yourselves. What are you pursuing? You have to sit and chew on it, and there's no point in lying because the one you're lying to knows you're lying. The point in answering honestly is to get yourself out of the way. What are you pursuing? In this life, what are you chasing after? Our world promises you an idealized vision of life, liberty, and happiness, but our God freely offers you life, liberty, in the pursuit of his love. So are you pursuing him? Are you chasing him? What visions cast by a broken world have turned your heart in on itself? And are you ready to submit to his will no matter the cost? Heavenly Father, as we come before you this morning, release the grip we have on those things of our life. Help us to set them at the foot of the cross this morning so we may come before you with open hands and glorious expectation of your love filling us. And may your light shine so deeply into the darkest spaces of our heart that we have no choice but to turn everything over to you. Amen.
Let's stand together.